Hi everyone, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our book opening event, the first book opening event that we are hosting here at the University of Latvia. And well, University of Latvia in general and Laboratory for Perceptual and Cognitive Systems is delighted to host a book launching event of Jody Azzouni's most recent monograph entitled Challenging Knowledge, How We Sometimes Don't Know What We Think We Know, which appears at Oxford University Press July 2025. And well, before moving to the overview talk by Professor Azzouni and also commentaries by prominent scholars and wonderful colleagues, let me give the floor to my colleague and University of Latvia Council Chairman and a prominent physicist, Professor Mātis Auziņš.
Thank you. Dear colleagues in the audience, dear colleagues who are watching us on the web, for University of Latvia it's great honor and I would say intellectual pleasure to welcome all of you to this book opening event, because we can foresee that here will be interesting and enlightening discussion. From my side, I got a chance to read this book already for some time from Professor Azzouni via Jody Azzouni. I got the copy of the book already, I guess, a couple of months ago. And thank you for the copy. And when I was reading this book, and as Professor Azzouni said, I am physicist, so it's not my kind of immediate type of reading, what I am doing professionally. But for me, I got two, I don't know, impulses from this book. First of all, I learned again and again, and in this book is a very interesting and very good example, that about very deep and very challenging social issues, professional books, academic books can be written in the way that people who are not from that field, like myself, who is from physics, are still able to read book and are able to enjoy book. And this is what I'm trying to tell my colleagues in Latvia, especially from social sciences. My colleagues very often are writing very kind of very deep professional books, and sometimes they are readable for everybody, but not everywhere, not every time. And I think that this is a good example how books can be written for general audience as well. Another kind of impulse which I got from that book. People in Latvia know that for many years we have some intellectual journal, Rigas Laiks. Unfortunately, it's stopped to be published, but anyway, in this journal there always have been very interesting and very kind of challenging interviews conducted by Arnis Rītups. And he always tried to surprise his people whom he have been interviewing with last questions. This last question very often have been, you have lived for some time in this world. What you have learned during your life? And answers from his audience have been very different, sometimes very deep, sometimes kind of people trying to simply make some jokes. But definitely they have been surprised with this question very often. And at some point I started to think, if somebody would be asking me this question, what I have learned during my career, during my life, what I would be answering. And usually my feeling was that each time when I started to think about that question, the answer would be different. But still, to continue to think about that, at some point I came to one single answer, which I think resonates with this book very directly. Because what I actually think I have learned during my life is that some things which I assume that are absolutely obvious, like 2 times 2 is 4. And I was absolutely convinced that I know answer for some particular question. And not once, very often, I faced situations, then it appears that finally I appeared to be wrong. So like in the title and the content of the book, that seems things which we are convinced that they are correct, that we know simple answers, appears that some answers are more complicated, and sometimes our opinions have been wrong. So I guess that everybody in the audience here and everybody who is watching us and everybody who will be reading this book or already is reading this book or reading this book will be challenged. The book will force people to think about things in which we believe and how correct they appear to be and how correct they are. So thank you everybody for coming here from, as I said, from audience here and for our online audience. And I think that discussion will be challenging. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Azzouni, for your kind introductory words. And now I'm delighted to give the floor to Jody Azzouni. Jody is a professor of philosophy, theorist of knowledge, philosopher of language with wide spectrum interests and with a background in mathematics. And without wasting more time, floor is yours, Jody. We are happy to have you here, and you're welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here. I guess I should start by thanking many people. You for spearheading the organizing of this event and your team. I want to thank Marcis Ozens. I'm going to mangle names in general. I mangle my own name. I'm just letting you know that's a weakness of mine that I've had since early childhood. Well, traumatized in 3rd grade when I discovered that my name was not my name, that there was a different name, and which I could not pronounce. So anyway, never mind that. That's sad and tragic, and let's not talk about that. So thanks to Marcis Ozens for that very kind introduction. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the University of Latvia in general, and specifically its public relations department that a number of you have been dealing with. It's very good. I want to thank the participants, and I want to thank, of course, all of you attendees, Zooming and otherwise. So let me start this way. In philosophy, especially in philosophy, it often isn't clear exactly what the moving parts are in an argument, or even how a philosophical position understood broadly hangs together. And this is because philosophical arguments are almost never formalized, and so they involve all the difficulties that arise with arguments whenever they occur in natural language. Implicit assumptions are the main problem. Implicit assumptions that no one, neither the opponents nor the proponents, realize, and this can go on for millennia. They haven't articulated them. They're buried in a perfectly straightforward sense of buried. And that's not the only problem. There's also the logical structure of how a position hangs together. What assumptions depend on what assumptions? Which ones are really central? And that can remain unclear, again, for centuries. So this is premature, but here's my shot at what the major moving pieces are in the epistemic position that I've developed in challenging. I claim that starting point epistemology, SPE, coupled with agent-centered rationality, so there's the jargon, are keys to resolving philosophical skepticism. Anyway, this is what I say on the back of the book. So what are the big ideas here? This way of talking, I've noticed, this is how some people try to publicize certain kinds of books. So I'm trying to get onto that bandwagon. So I didn't mention one important move, which is also on the back of the book. And I'm going to discuss it first because I'm exploring the idea here that this is actually the central move of challenging. Although I didn't quite think of it this way when I wrote the book. So this is the distinction between cognition and metacognition. This is being talked about in philosophy. This is being talked about in psychology. This is being talked about in cognitive science. It's becoming more and more important. So we need, so I'm saying now, to keep, for philosophical issues, we need to keep clearly distinct those cases where agents are cognizing, exercising a knowledge skill, for example, from cases where an agent is metacognizing. That is, thinking about aspects of their cognition. And here I'm thinking of sophisticated agents who are thinking about their beliefs, or what justifies their beliefs, or what they think they know and why, or whether they know what they know and don't know, what rules they're following, what they're claiming about something, how they need to justify what they're claiming, and so on. All of that's metacognition. A cognizing agent, however, which can be a human, is often in what's now called a state of flow, right? And that's become really popular, and all the, you know, it's being studied in cognitive science, but it's spilled over into the popular literature, especially with athletics, where it's actually almost was seen first with people like McEnroe, et cetera. Okay. These people, or when in these states, embody isn't a bad word, what they know in action and in speech without thinking or contemplating anything about their knowledge, about their own beliefs, or about themselves in any respect. And so now it's broad. Animals hunting down prey, many mathematicians working on proofs, very skilled tennis players, or almost everyone engaged in simple arithmetic, counting and adding, and ordinary conversation cognize and don't metacognize. They aren't thinking about what they're doing or how they're doing it. They're just doing it. And often while simultaneously thinking about or doing something else. I've argued in my previous epistemology book, Attributing Knowledge, that knowledge of P, so P is going to be this variable that keeps popping up for a sentence, proposition, etc., P, that knowledge of P doesn't require belief in P or even consciousness of P. This sort of ground floor knowledge, cognition, doesn't require justification or even awareness of justification. And I say this accords with the phenomenology, our experience of knowledge. It also explains something we do all the time, attribute knowledge to animals of all sorts, insects, for example, as well as devices of various sorts, AI, and so on. I argued in attributing that standard tools in lexical semantics show that these are ordinary, typical, and correct knowledge attributions. The result is that a large number of the traditional necessary conditions that philosophers have placed on a cognitive agent, if that agent is to know something, these are spurious. And this helps subsequently in challenging against skepticism. Important, it's very hard for us to distinguish when we're engaged in metacognition as opposed to cognition and vice versa. The distinction is primarily a psychological one, although it seems to be indicated in usage by various ways of speaking. John is running is true, metacognitive. John is running, cognitive. I know that John is running, metacognitive. I'm just talking about usage. I believe that I know that John is running, metacognitive, and so on. However, the cognitive-metacognitive distinctions as they show up in usage often don't correspond to the psychological states that the speaking agents are in. And so an old and now outdated joke illustrates this nicely. Do you know the time? B asks C. Yes, I do, C responds, and then says nothing more or walks off. Right? C's response answers the literal metacognitive question. Do you know the time? But B, of course, wasn't asking for that. B just wanted to know the time. and was asking for it in the peculiar way that we still ask others about things like that. Where's the bathroom? Said straight out to a stranger sounds rude, or at least it does in my neck of the woods. Do you know where the bathroom is? Doesn't sound rude. And it's interesting to try to figure out why that is. It's a very significant fact about usage that when we talk about justification, we invariably talk about beliefs or claims. It's natural to ask, why do you believe that? Or why are you claiming that? And when we do, we're asking for a reason that justifies the belief or claim. Our concern isn't directly with what the belief is a belief of or what the claim is about. Our concern is whether those beliefs or claims can themselves be justified. So we're focused on claims and beliefs and only indirectly about what they're claims of and beliefs about. Here's some more evidence of this. Although good justifications for claims and beliefs can be about the content of the claims of the beliefs, what their beliefs or claims about, they needn't be. Someone may say that they know P because they heard it from someone authoritative. That the person is authoritative justifies the claim or belief. And this shows that it's the claim or belief that's being justified and not what the claim or belief is about. Contrast this with knowledge. If we ask instead, why do you know that? We aren't asking for a reason. We're asking how you came by what you know. What led to your having that knowledge? And this is something you might or might not know. Similarly, we don't say ever, justify that knowledge. Although we can say, justify that knowledge claim. Knowing that P is a relation between the agent and what P, the proposition, describes. It's not a relation to the proposition itself. Usage here rather directly points to the idea that although a belief that P can accompany knowledge of P, this isn't because a belief in P is a necessary condition for knowledge of P. It's not even that coming to believe something, for example, by justifying the belief to one's satisfaction, has that much to do with how one comes to know things. So, one use of talk of beliefs and believe, thus, is obviously metacognitive. And so making a belief that P, a necessary condition for knowing P, is misguided because it confounds cognition and metacognition. That belief and believe function metacognitively is indicated by an entire body of expressions that naturally apply to talk of beliefs, but don't apply at all to talk of knowledge. We naturally speak of beliefs as being rational or irrational. We naturally speak of someone's beliefs being irresponsible or silly or well thought out or glib. It's just odd to say that someone's knowledge is well thought out. Although we can describe someone's knowledge as superficial because they don't know enough. That's what that comes to. All these expressions that I mentioned before, ones that philosophers think are normative, important word, apply naturally to the beliefs people have and not to what they know. Of course, if belief in P is a necessary condition for knowledge of P, and if, as many have believed, the relationship between knowledge and belief is even more intimate, because knowing something is just having a certain kind of belief, this looks like it was Descartes' view, then these normative terms derivatively apply to knowledge by the connection of belief to knowledge. And that's how long ago Jaegwon Kim argued that epistemology was a normative subject area. He saw justification, justified belief, as necessary for knowledge. If I'm right in claiming that knowledge isn't intrinsically metacognitive, then any connection between belief, justified or otherwise, and knowledge has to go a different way. This is one of the claims of challenging, that the connection between an agent's beliefs and what they know occurs when an agent has beliefs about their knowledge. The key tool I reach for to illustrate this in challenging is by analyzing debates between skeptics and non-skeptics. Because I'm going to argue that whole process is metacognitive. So certain debates are intrinsically metacognitive, maybe not all debates, but debates that involve the asking for and the giving of reasons and justifications for debated claims, they're intrinsically metacognitive. Where a skeptic challenges a knowledge claimant to provide justifications for what they claim to know, that's metacognitive. And correspondingly, these debates have all the symptoms of metacognition that I've already mentioned. So start with this. Knowledge claims are justified or fail to be justified. And a knowledge claim is a claim about knowledge. So this too is metacognitive. So what's actually happening in a debate between skeptics and knowledge claimants isn't that the knowledge of the knowledge claimant is being challenged by the skeptic. At least that knowledge isn't being challenged directly. As I just mentioned, we can't ask someone to justify their knowledge. We can only ask for them to justify that they have knowledge of something, P, for example, or any P. What of a knowledge claim is the agent's belief that they know something. Consider how challenges can go. P, someone says, so this someone isn't metacognizing yet. But it's possible there could be a situation just like this one where in fact not P, the skeptic says, just that plaintively. And if the skeptic is successful, the claimant says, oh wow, I guess I don't know P. I'm making this all sound overwrought, but in practice it often is. And the claimant's belief that they know P has been dislodged. Or someone says P, and the skeptic says, you need a justification for P. What's your justification? Oh, right, the claimant says, Q. But here, the claimant has accepted a skeptical claim about the knowledge claim P. It needs a justification. Again, metacognition. So in skeptical debates, belief does come into things, but not in the way most philosophers have thought, that a belief in P is a necessary condition for knowledge of P. Rather, belief comes in because what's challenged is a knowledge claimant's belief that they know P. That's why these debates are intrinsically metacognitive. And further, notice that the attempt of the knowledge claimant to justify their knowledge claim just comes to an attempt to justify their belief that they know what they think they know. Justifying their belief comes first. So if the skeptic has been successful, then the skeptic has undercut the knowledge claimant's belief that they know something and hasn't directly undercut the knowledge of that claimant. A further sequence of inferences of some sort is required to undercut the agent's actual knowledge. According to previous approaches to knowledge, belief, and justification, these inferences were easy. Indeed, currently, a lot of philosophers think misleading information suffices to undercut knowledge of P. Knowledge of P can be lost simply because an agent's confidence in P is undercut. And that's sufficient for undercutting that agent's belief in P, which in turn undercuts their knowledge of P. None of these inferences, according to me, are legitimate. Furthermore, knowledge can't be lost this way. And I discuss this in attributing as well as in challenging. The idea that misleading information can cost an agent their knowledge badly fits with the usage data. The history of science literature and detective novels often both describe scenarios where misleading evidence causes people to deny what they thought they knew. But these cases are never described as ones where people knew things, then they didn't, then they did again, and so on. Belief, though, can be lost and gained and lost again in just this way. If belief in P were a necessary condition on knowing P, the knowledge too would ebb and flow as belief does. This is another way to recognize that belief in P can't be a necessary condition for knowing P. In any case, that the skeptic undercuts belief of an agent that they know P, but not directly the knowledge itself, opens another general pathway to undercutting certain kinds of skepticism. For it can be that an agent loses their belief that they know something or other, or in the worst case, their belief that they know anything. But in fact, their knowledge is left intact. They know, but don't believe they know. And indeed, it's common for philosophers to hang out in bars. I think this is still common. And so when a bunch of skeptics are having drinks and one of them asks another if they know where the bathroom is, invariably the person who goes to the bar regularly knows where it is and says so. Do you know where the bathroom is in this place? Absolutely. You have to go down the steps over there to the left. So if I can establish that, in fact, agents have knowledge independently of skeptical debates, then this sort of situation is natural. A person's beliefs are no longer according with what they know. And so I argue, independently of skeptical arguments, for a picture of cognitive agents as having knowledge. And in particular, I argue that I have knowledge. So this is one major component of SPE. I argue that I have knowledge. And that means the skeptic has, here's more jargon, the relativized burden of proof of showing that I don't have the knowledge I think I have. So I've just used this phrase, relativized burden of proof, and I should explain it. This idea is connected to something else I make a big deal about in the book, namely agent-centered rationality. The idea is that human cognitive agents start by believing that they know things, rather a lot of things. Global skeptics, I don't know anything, only seem to live in insane asylums and in philosophy departments. This is a very old joke, right? And when they're in philosophy departments, they don't act on their official lack of knowledge, thank God. This isn't a criticism. It's again to point out where we start epistemically. We start, as I said, with the belief that we know a lot, and indeed, many specific beliefs about what we know and don't know arise in early childhood. Strikingly, know is one of the earliest words children acquire, and they use it all the time. That fact structures how debates between skeptics and knowledge claimants can go. The claimant starts by believing they know a great deal and claiming often they know a great deal as well. And the skeptic endeavors to push them from that position. So an argumentative strategy of challenging is that, and I do this over and over again in a fairly granular way, someone is pushed to believing they don't know globally what they take themselves to know, what they believe themselves to know. But it only happens because they illegitimately concede to arguments that shouldn't move them, the ones that skeptics raise. So the idea of relativized burden of proof is this: an agent can be moved from their knowledge claim if they understand, according to their own lights, that the argument should move them. This is the content of agent-centered rationality. The agent has to see that the argument should move them. So the second chapter of the book on G.E. Moore illustrates the relatively minor ways that an agent shouldn't be moved from their position. For example, if they don't understand the argument, if they think the argument looks right, but they have questions about it, and so on. The point of the relativized is that the skeptic may recognize the argument is good, whereas the knowledge claimant doesn't see that. Both parties are then rational to retain their respective claims. So this is really the upshot. Agent-centered rationality in general is flawed. It's rational for you to stick by your reasoning, even if there are flaws in it, as long as you don't see that there are flaws in it. Agent relative rationality isn't transcendental, as I put it, maybe a little sarcastically. It's not ideal reasoning. If someone makes a reasoning error, that person will inferentially take missteps, but that's not to be irrational. Because both parties can rationally keep their opposing positions, it looks like the following possibility is live. Someone can start, as it were, from a skeptical position and remain there. I show that this is incoherent by using arguments that support SPE, that every cognitive agent has knowledge whether they believe it or not. So this relies on a characterization of knowledge that I take myself to know, that an agent knows P if the methods by which they come to grasp P are sufficiently reliable. Grasping P is an umbrella term for how agents process information and then rely on it for action. So it doesn't require the grasping of propositions, linguistic items, but is instead is compatible with the processes by which insects and drones come to know things. I'm not going to say that about AI, not this bit. This isn't to say that a rational agent, a philosopher, might come to think they know nothing. They can make mistakes, but that isn't to say they're right about what they don't know. And this last piece of jargon, I think, is epistemic condescension. One can smile to oneself when talking to that philosopher in everyday life, watching how their knowledge enables them to maneuver despite their official skeptical stances. Later chapters of the book consider other ways that skeptics challenge knowledge claimants. And as with the examples I just discussed, my position resembles Quine's early naturalized epistemology, if only because I adopt Descartes' approach in the Meditations. As I said earlier, I'm seeing the skeptic as challenging my knowledge claims, and I'm using whatever I know to rebut the skeptical arguments. And here's where SPE doesn't echo Quine's naturalized epistemology. Where we start, according to me, is where each one of us starts. We're not all in one web of beliefs stretching across every individual, as it does according to the Quinean picture. It is true that some of our individual knowledge items we acquired directly, and some of them we know by virtue of being in a collective. General relativity is true. This is why chapters of challenging rely on, for example, the scientific literature on hallucinations, lucid dreaming, and so on, as legitimate tools that the proponent of SPE can use against skeptics, if they know that stuff, the way that we know stuff that we read about and do appropriate research for. In any case, that we have such knowledge is what we, sophisticated metacognizers, believe. We don't believe it in the sense of having a lot of propositions in our heads that we're conscious of, P, Q, R, etc., but in the sense that we rely on implicitly and explicitly a body of knowledge that our beliefs track, but only to some extent. So here's where I can go on the offensive against skepticism, as it were. I can allow myself what I take myself to know about logic, about how the word knows works, about how evidence is acquired, about what the scientific literature currently tells us about hallucinations, and so on. I can use all my beliefs about what I know that's relevant to skeptical arguments. Epistemology is a special science, as I like to say. And so here is where I'm licensed to oppose some of the Cartesian skeptics' standard tools, such as treating logical possibility as epistemic possibility. It's important to evaluate that particular tool of the skeptic, use of logical possibility, because the basic structure of skeptical debates, at least with respect to Cartesian skepticism, is one where the knowledge claimant is challenged by possibilities in which a possible world clone of that claimant doesn't know what they think they know. Here's where I need to distinguish what I describe as real possibilities from specious, purely logical ones. And this is one place where illegitimate burden shifting occurs, or so I claim. The consistency of such possibilities is usually just assumed by both challengers and knowledge claimants on the sheer basis of imaginative thought experiments, brains in vats, evil demons, instead of via a genuine showing that the possibility described is consistent. And something I make a big deal about, because it's based on a logical result, Church, establishing the consistency of a skeptical scenario, the set of propositions describing that scenario, is just not an easy thing to do. So too, I describe a common strategy used by skeptics that I call going to extremes. The word knows, as I try to show in challenging and earlier in attributing, is vague. But it isn't visibly vague the way bald is. The vagueness arises just where I indicated earlier in my characterization of a method of knowing as one that's sufficiently reliable. This is open to negotiation, sufficiently reliable. It can shift. And in the sense that methods may be discarded over time because we come to think they aren't sufficiently reliable. There are too many false positives. But because the word is vague, no, and despite the fact that knows is compatible with agents being fallible, that an agent's methods all an agent's methods, all our methods, not God, can lead to false positives, we can be pushed by rhetoric to withdraw knowledge claims where we shouldn't. I think lottery intuitions that everybody's been excited about, leading the lottery paradox, etc., they're a case of this. We can be pushed to think we never know we have a losing ticket before the winning ticket is announced, even though if the odds of possessing a winning ticket are low enough, I want to say, we do know we have a losing ticket, unless in fact we don't. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of the literature focuses on the fact that when people have bought the ticket, they don't want to sell it for a penny. And they're forgetting all those people out there, and I'm one of them, who never buy lottery tickets. Why don't we buy lottery tickets? Because we'll buy a losing lottery ticket. That's why. And I'd rather buy chewing gum. Okay. So here I'm opposing skeptical strategies by relying on my knowledge of the lexical properties of know, specifically its compatibility with agential fallibility and its vagueness. I also use the vagueness of know in attributing to explain the usage shiftiness data that epistemic contextualists are so fond of. I think it can be explained this way, and we can drop the contextualist move. So the other content of the book involves very specific arguments against various skeptical moves, as well as other epistemic topics I'm concerned with. For example, I analyze the notion of justification, which I've already argued is intrinsically metacognitive, and I show that it metacognitively traces reliability, where reliability, of course, is connected to knowledge and justification is connected to beliefs about what you know. Okay. That is, it isn't that justified beliefs are ones that are required for knowledge. Knowledge just comes about via reliable processes that drones use. Okay. And we justify our beliefs that we know things by showing that the processes that we take ourselves to have come to know these things are in fact reliable. So again, the cognitive metacognitive theme is showing up. By the way, it seems clear to me that AI has reached the point, ChatGPT has reached the point where, in fact, it justifies itself. It engages in a certain amount of metacognition. what I think is crucial is this is all independent of whether it's conscious or not, or anything like that. And that's important. There is a tendency to treat all the propositional attitudes together. This actually stems, I think, from my former colleague Dan Dennett's intentional stance move. But I actually think the propositional attitudes all have to be separated, taken apart, and analyzed separately. They're doing very different things. Anyway, so near the beginning of this talk, I guess this is a couple of quick riders, and then I'm done. Near the beginning of this talk, I spoke of the exercise of cognition as one of utilizing our ground floor knowledge. And I don't want it to be thought that I'm suggesting there are different kinds of knowledge, ground floor knowledge, say, and meta-knowledge. What makes something a piece of meta-knowledge isn't that it's a special kind of knowledge. All knowledge is the same. The use of a sufficiently reliable method to establish what is known. Knowing that P is meta-knowledge only if P is about one's own knowledge. Simple as that. I may know that I know P. If I do, it's because how I come to know that I know P is via a sufficiently reliable process of grasping that I know P. So obviously, it's impossible for me to describe everything that's in the book, every move I make. I always write too much. Mea culpa, I'm sorry. But most of what I do here happens against the general background moves I've just described, especially the divide between cognition and metacognition. And so I thought I would take this opportunity to approach how the arguments in challenging are structured in a way that I don't quite pursue in the book, making the metacognitive-cognitive divide central by connecting it to the very different roles that belief and knowledge play vis-a-vis, specifically skepticism. So here's an important thing I want to say, last thing. Having looked over challenging last night, because I don't always sleep at night, one of the things I noticed is that I sometimes talk about meta-knowledge, and I shouldn't be. I should be talking about belief. It doesn't, it's a tweak, but it's an important one given what I've been saying here about what's going on. Okay, that's all. So.
Thanks a lot, Jody. That was very, very nice. Thank you so much.
Right, I was going to add that I hope I didn't go too long. I don't think I did. And because, you know, a full 45 minutes was punitive. But this thing is going to get distributed. Jurgis is taking care of that, as well as everything else that he's taking care of. Okay.
Oh, thanks, Jody. So we have time for a couple of questions or comments or remarks or any questions or any brief comments in the audience in Zoom universe or in physical co-presence.
Universe.
Yeah. Well, galaxies and universes. So one question from my perspective is, do you think that your approach to knowledge and all the cognitive, metacognitive distinction-wise issues, whether that has consequences for a rational choice approach? Because this is one of the topics that I teach time to time to graduate students, and I was wondering whether you see some links to that.
Well, yes, but not directly to knowledge, to belief, and in particular to belief about knowledge. Belief, I'm saying, is the target of rationality. So it's going to be target of decision theory, all the stuff that people have been focusing on, actually, really about belief has been thought to connect to knowledge. And I'm suggesting it doesn't, because knowledge is not, under certain circumstances, knowledge can be acquired through one's beliefs. But those are special cases. That's what I want to stress. And the fact that creatures that don't have beliefs in any robust sense, like insects and drones, and creatures that do have beliefs in somewhat rudimentary senses, and I think The target should be its belief that kind of gets graded, gets more sophisticated, gets additional conditions added. It's not knowledge. Knowledge is good all the way down, and it's pretty straightforward. It's primitive compared to belief. Okay, and so there's cognitive science literature that kind of seems to illustrate that. Knowledge comes first as a concept. Theory of mind and belief, others' beliefs, how that works, that comes second. That comes later. And for some people, not at all. And I could get political at this point, but I won't.
Thanks, Jody. That was great. Well, if there are no other questions, comments, neither from one nor the other galaxy, so let me start our commentary part. And I think this is a very nice idea to have a vibrant discussion and vibrant set of commentaries. And let me start by first commentator Curry, the chair from from Clemson University, previously from Minnesota Center of Philosophy of Science. So Curry, I'm delighted to give the floor to you.
Oh dear, we can't hear you, Corey.
There we go. I should have now clicked the unmute button. Can you guys all see my slides?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful.
We can, yeah.
So first of all, I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me and the other speakers for being patient with my inability to schedule things. They all had to move their spots around because I realized there was a faculty meeting that I had not previously accounted for. I also wanted to thank Jody for this really interesting and exciting and I think very provocative book. So this book, The Challenging Knowledge, starts from what I think Jody would recognize as a banality. Specifically, it starts from the banality that we, and here we means epistemic agents, must start our epistemic investigations from where we are. Speaking very broadly, the project of challenging knowledge is to turn this banality into a view, what Azzouni calls starting point epistemology, what I'll sometimes refer to as SPE in what follows. This view is characterized by two commitments. First, any cognitive agent must have some occurrent knowledge or other. Second, cognitively sophisticated agents should assume that they have knowledge. SPE is thus a strongly anti-skeptical view. It holds that the skeptic is wrong and that their arguments fail. And Azzouni devotes much of the book to addressing various arguments for external world skepticism, demons, dreams, brains in vats, and the like, and showing how Moore's famous rebuttal of the skeptic can be read as using our starting banality to reject skepticism. After all, Moore, and the rest of us too, knows that he has two hands. So if he's starting from what he knows, then it follows quite simply that there is an external world, at least in the sense that's relevant to the debate. Now, what I want to do in today's comments is ask how far this position actually gets us. And slightly more specifically, I want to ask, can starting point epistemology be used to address other kinds of skepticism? And even more specifically than that, can it be used to address inductive skepticism? And I think with a little bit of, additions, the answer is yes. So let's start out by talking about what inductive skepticism is and the uniformity of nature. And I want to introduce a sort of protagonist here, a protagonist that I'm going to call Alina. Alina takes herself to know that the sun will rise tomorrow. She has moved beyond a little bit sort of simple reasons for thinking that the sun will rise tomorrow. She's not just, it has risen, yes, it rose yesterday, it rose this morning. If you asked her, that is, why she's confident that the sun will rise tomorrow, she would respond by linking the sun's motions through the heavens to the rotation of the earth. Of course, she knows that it's possible for the rotation of the earth to be, stopped, and thus the rising of the sun to stop as well. But given what she knows about the kinds of forces that would be necessary in order to stop the rotation of the earth, she thinks that it's extremely unlikely that we would encounter anything capable of generating that kind of force, let alone that we would do so without detecting this extraterrestrial object ahead of time. So Alina is not vulnerable to the kind of mere possibility challenges that Azzouni discusses throughout Challenging Knowledge. She is aware that there are possibilities, possible scenarios in which what she believes would be false, but she takes these scenarios to be very remote, and on that basis, not to challenge her knowledge properly. So now this protagonist who claims to have inductive knowledge, meets a skeptic. Call this skeptic Carl. Carl tells Alina that he does not believe that the sun will rise tomorrow, and that she, crucially, does not know that it will. On what grounds does he argue that she doesn't have this kind of knowledge? First, he insists that if Alina is to justify or give an argument for believing that the sun will rise tomorrow, she must assume that nature is uniform, that the future is like the past. He then goes on to argue that there is no way to justify this argument, or this assumption, sorry. Clearly, it cannot be established via deduction from first premises, as the extreme possibilities that I raised above indicate. Nor can it be established by induction, because that would be circular. Thus, he argues, Alina has no grounds for her belief, so she should suspend judgment. She doesn't really have knowledge. Now, the first thing that I want to note about this argument is that the idea that induction rests or must rest on the uniformity of nature does not survive what seems to me even momentary scrutiny. This is a point that was made by Wesley Salmon in what I think is an unjustly ignored 1953 paper. Now, it's true that many people, especially prior to the quantum revolution, have believed that identical conditions always lead to identical outcomes, and that might be a plausible principle. But this is not sufficient to warrant any interesting inductive conclusion, and is by all appearances irrelevant to induction as we actually practice it. After all of us live in a world in which time marches on, and so conditions are never exactly identical to the conditions that we had in the past. Hence the famous "you never step in the same river twice." Now, more widely applicable versions of this principle, of the sort of same past conditions, same future outcome, are not just unjustifiable, but I think patently false. We all expect the world to change all the time. No one believes that sunshine today means sunshine tomorrow, or that daylight at noon guarantees daylight at midnight. And any child on their birthday can tell you that one day of difference makes a huge difference to their age in a way that the 363 days prior hadn't, even though those days are very, very similar to the one day that makes the difference. So if induction is to rest on the uniformity of nature, Alina has much bigger problems than Carl's dilemma. The principle that she is alleged to assume is not just unjustifiable, but obviously incorrect. But I think the problem here is with the principle, not with Alina or her reasoning. Alina can rightly respond that nowhere in her justification for believing that the sun will rise tomorrow did she appeal to the uniformity of nature. Her assumptions were much more limited. She took herself to know that the laws of nature tend not to change from day to day, that it would take a very substantial force to halt the Earth's rotation, and that it's very unlikely that anything would exert that level of force in the immediate future. None of these are uniformity principles, at least not obviously. Now, this brings us back to starting point epistemology. Now, it's true, Alina has not shown that she knows that these assumptions are true, but SPE says that she doesn't need to, because her response is sufficient as it stands. Carl argues that Alina does not know that the sun will rise tomorrow because it's possible that the future is not like the past. Alina agrees, it's possible the future is not like the past, but she thinks that the conclusion does not follow. Her claim to knowledge is compatible with the future being quite different from the past, which means that Carl has failed to establish his conclusion. He's failed to establish that she doesn't know. And while Alina has not offered any argument to the effect that Carl should believe that the sun will rise tomorrow, she's not obliged to, according to starting point epistemology. Carl is challenging her knowledge, and as Azzouni repeatedly emphasizes, that means that the relativized burden of proof is on Carl. Alina only has good first personal reasons to concede Carl's challenge if his argument can't be sustained. And since she thinks it can't be, she needs to show nothing more to be justified in holding on to her knowledge claim. Perhaps, however, I've given Carl a bit of short shrift here. Perhaps this is not really the main point of the kind of inductive skeptic's argument. I think there are two really principled rejoinders that Carl would be likely to go for here. The first rejoinder is to put aside the uniformity of nature as kind of a red herring. Carl's real concern is simply that we cannot offer any argument in favor of the reliability or trustworthiness of inductive inference. Deductive arguments are unsuccessful for the reasons already indicated. It's possible that our inferences are wrong. And inductive arguments are circular and therefore fail to justify. So Carl might sort of come up, instead of appealing to the uniformity of nature, he might give us some sort of putative condition on knowledge, like what I've called standard here. The idea that any kind of inductive knowledge, any kind of inferential knowledge at least, relies on our ability to give a non-circular argument for the reliability of the methods or trustworthiness that it relies on, that it rests on. I think this is in some ways what a lot of people view as the heart of the challenge to the inductivist. But I think this response should compel Alina no more than the former one does, or than the former argument does, because I think Alina has good reasons to reject what I've called standard. To see this, consider Lewis Carroll's famous discussion of Achilles and the tortoise. As Carroll shows in that paper, deduction suffers the same indignity as induction does here. One cannot justify the use of deductive principles in general without assuming that at least one deductive inference is justified. So if Carl's rejoinder is successful, therefore, it would seem to undercut not just inductive inference, but deductive inference as well, if it's applied consistently at least. And since Alina, I think we should grant Alina the reasonable assumption that deductive inference is justifiable, and thus she has good reason to reject Carl's argument as it stands. Since the argument being offered entails something she knows to be false, she shouldn't accept it. Now, SPE is once again crucial to the story here. For Alina has still not offered us any explanation or any argument in favor of inductive inference. She has not explained how or why, or more crucially, when inductive inference works. But SPE says that she does not need to. Insofar as we are concerned only with Alina's perspective, we have no need of an argument for the reliability or trustworthiness of inductive inference, either in this particular case or in general, because Carl has failed to sustain his challenge. Alina, therefore, has no reason to put aside what she already knows. Perhaps here Carl's second rejoinder will be more successful. Because ultimately, Carl is not interested in undercutting Alina's belief that the sun will rise tomorrow. That's just a cute example. What he's interested in undercutting are any of Alina's beliefs that rely on induction, including all of the assumptions that she uses to justify her belief that the sun will rise tomorrow. So he might respond that Alina cannot justifiably rely on these assumptions because that knowledge too rests on inductive inference. If induction is suspect, then it all goes. Now, I think this rejoinder looks more promising, at least initially. After all, what Carl is doing here is challenging a specific method that Alina uses. And here I'm invoking some language from the latter half of challenging knowledge. He's arguing that the method of inductive inference has specific failure conditions, and that these conditions are not remote possibilities. There's a very important sense in which it's easy for inductive reasoning to fail. Since much of Alina's alleged knowledge depends on inductive methods, demonstrating that inductive methods are unreliable means undermining her claim to knowledge in many different settings, not just those in which she's reasoning about the sun rising tomorrow. So this is a sort of global challenge based on inductive skepticism as opposed to a local one. Carl skips going for the specific example and says all of your methods, all of your knowledge based on those methods are unreliable. I think this challenge is also unsuccessful, however. What Carl has really done here is essentially given up the game on inductive skepticism, properly so called. To see the point, consider a dilemma. Either Carl acknowledges that Alina's assumptions, if granted, are sufficient to justify her inductive inference to the conclusion that the sun will rise tomorrow, or he does not. If he does, his critique is no longer really a critique of inductive inference or induction, because he grants that inductive inferences can be justified even when the possibility of error has not been completely ruled out. In this case, his global challenge is really more of a challenge to the foundations of Alina's knowledge. What he's questioning is how inductive machinery can get off the ground. But that's just a very different challenge. That's something more like the Agrippa trilemma, as opposed to a challenge to inductive knowledge, as kind of inductive skepticism. So if Karl acknowledges that Alina's assumptions are sufficient to justify her inductive inference, his challenge, at least his challenge as it's directed as a kind of challenge against inductive inference, hasn't succeeded. The other horn is one in which Karl does not acknowledge that Alina's assumptions are sufficient to justify her inference. But in that case, he's offered nothing new when moving from this local challenge to a global one. He's still just arguing the same kind of, well, fallibilism means, or the sort of fallibility of inductive inference means that you don't have knowledge. But Alina already addressed that concern. She's already fine with saying that, with concluding that she has knowledge, even in the face of the possibility, the mere possibility of error. Karl has shown us nothing more to suggest that that error is actually realized. And since he hasn't offered that, he hasn't offered anything that should move her. Okay, so I think the arguments that are given above might seem underwhelming for a couple different reasons. For one, you might worry that I haven't really invoked starting point epistemology so much as just the relativized burden of proof, which is, of course, a consequence of starting point epistemology, but it's a weaker consequence. And in line with that, what I've done is really given an argument of why the skeptic can't force Alina out of her position, as opposed to one in which she's justified in holding her position in the first place. I've shown that Alina can hold on to her knowledge claim, in other words, but I haven't shown why we, as third-person observers, should accept that she has knowledge. Those are two different things if we're coming from the point of starting point epistemology. Finally, I've argued that Karl's challenge is not successful, but that's a very minimal criticism of what Karl's doing here. As Azzouni emphasizes, I think repeatedly throughout challenging knowledge, knowledge challenges can result in one party justifiably thinking that the challenge is successful and the others justifiably thinking that it's false or failed. I at least would like to be able to say something a little stronger about where Karl has gone wrong. So the first two of these concerns can be addressed together. For notice that the position that we find ourselves in as third-person viewers of the disagreement between Alina and Karl. Like Alina, we know, or at least I think I know, that the sun rises because the Earth rotates, that it would take a massive force to cause the Earth to stop rotating, that such forces are unlikely to appear out of nowhere, and that it's also unlikely for macroscopic laws to start operating in ways different from how we understand without warning, etc. Karl has offered arguments that aim to show that this knowledge is insufficient for knowledge that the sun will rise tomorrow, but we've also seen Alina's rebuttals to those arguments. And thus we have good reason to think that Alina's inference is reliable, because that is what the various assumptions, the things we take ourselves to know, entail. They show that the possibility of being wrong about the sun rising tomorrow is extremely remote. So we, from our starting point, should take Alina to have knowledge, which means that she hasn't just won a debate on technical grounds, she has what we, from our starting point, ought to see as good reasons for her position, at least according to starting point epistemology. What of Karl? What should we, as third-person observers, say about his position? One option, and I think an option that has always been on the table, is that we could do what Jody labels condescension. We could look at Karl and say that he knows far more than he claims to. After all, if Karl is at all like the rest of us, he would be surprised if the world suddenly stopped or suddenly began to violate those inductive conclusions that we all take to be justified. He doesn't think that if you let go of a glass of water some sort of feet or meters above the ground, that it would just hover in the air. That would surprise him if that happened. He might deny that he knows that it wouldn't happen, but we can condescend to him and say, yes, of course he knows that. But I think SPE offers us something better. It seems to me that Karl is alike us, or alike to us in another way. He likely used to dogmatically slumber in the assumption that the sun would rise tomorrow, and it is only philosophical arguments that have pushed him to deny that we have this kind of knowledge. What SPE shows us, however, is that if Karl is like us in that way, if he used to think that he had this knowledge, he's made a mistake. He was swayed by arguments that did not actually undercut his knowledge. He moved from the epistemic position that he was in to an epistemic position he is now, based on arguments that should not have rationally compelled him. And I think this is a genuinely new tool in our anti-skeptical toolbox. What SPE tells us is that most of us could not become skeptics without reasoning irrationally, without granting challenges to our knowledge that we ought not to grant. Of course, there are probably some people who are born skeptics, but I think that's likely an unusual case. So most of us could not become skeptics without behaving irrationally. Now, I emphasize that this is not an argument that ought to compel the inductive skeptic away from their skepticism, at least not the inductive skeptic who recognizes where the burden of proof lies. That strikes me as almost definitionally impossible. If I could show that inductive inferences were acceptable according to the lights of a committed deductivist, what I would have shown is that the relevant inferences were not inductive, that they were just deductive, properly so called. And the inductive skeptic would be justified in responding to the move that I've just made by sort of saying that two wrongs do not make a right. Just because they've reached their position on bad arguments doesn't mean that they should be moved away from it by other arguments that do not actually meet the burden of proof. But I think it should now be clear, and perhaps clearer than ever before, that the idea of convincing the sort of inductive skeptic that they should accept inductive inferences is just the wrong target. It would be nice if we could do that. It would also be nice if we could give an account of why and how inductive inferences work. I think that's something that all of us would probably like to be able to do. But what we've seen is that we don't need that, at least in the context of just responding to the arguments of the inductive skeptic. The inductivist can defend her knowledge without such an account because she can rebut the challenges that are raised. And we, the third-person audience to such a debate, can and should conclude that not only is she rational in taking herself to have knowledge, she is right to do so, at least if we're adopting the starting point epistemologist's position. So I'll just wrap up very briefly here, because there's more work to be done, I think, obviously. Much of what I've said in the last 15 minutes or so draws from sources other than challenging knowledge, not just Lewis Carroll and Wesley Salmon, but John Norton and James Van Cleve. But it seems to me that starting point epistemology plays a really key role in the story that I've just told, and bringing these disparate threads together and showing that the various rejoinders that people have given to the arguments of the inductive skeptic are not just sort of failed attempts to justify induction. They are successful moves in responding to the skeptic's challenge to the knowledge that the rest of us take us to have. And I think that in that way, challenging knowledge has produced at least one very cool, very interesting result. So thank you all. And thank you again to Jody for this excellent book.
Thank you.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks. Thank you so much. So any comments, questions, or any interactions? Well,
I don't know if I'm supposed to say things or not, or much. I don't have to. I can talk to him later. I can say, but generally speaking, I agreed with everything. The only additional move I was going to make, which is in challenging, is to describe the logic, as it were, of justification. Corey knows this, and say that built into the notion of justification is that you increase, when you justify a proposition, you increase its truth likelihood. And that one of the problems, the circularity problem, shows that you can't offer a justification for induction for just that reason. However, the reliability of the inductive inferences are untouched by this. So this is a place where justification and reliability for knowledge come apart. And I think that's part of what makes the problem of induction so puzzling. So I do talk about that in the book, in passing, rapidly. I don't know, 3 paragraphs, sorry. Anyway, that's all I was going to say.
Yeah, if I can respond just briefly, I think I have been very sketchy in this talk. Let's be fair. There are very interesting questions I think to be answered about how far the the line that some people have tried to run, and that I tried to run today to some extent. James Van Cleve was the name I mentioned earlier. Stathis Psillos has another argument like this, that we can sort of separate out the particular inductive inferences from the sort of general rule. John Norton is defending this a lot recently. I think there's some really interesting questions to be asked about whether that will solve the kind of justification problem that you just pointed to, Jody. But I think in some sense, those questions can only be asked once we recognize that what we're doing there is not trying to convince the deductive skeptic. Because if we keep trying to convince the deductive skeptic, we're just going to churn our wheels over and over again. They're never going to be convinced. That's impossible. So what's really crucial is recognizing that what we are trying to do as inductivists, and I think this is already in some sense clear in sort of the early work by Van Cleve, though the justification, well, there we go again. The justification for it is not explicit in the way that it is in your book, is to show how our own knowledge is possible. And then once we've made that move, there's lots of interesting more stuff to be done about thinking about, okay, what does this actually tell us about our own knowledge? Does it tell us that our knowledge is justified, or does it come apart in the way that you suggest?
Okay, thanks. Though there was one question also in the audience. Perhaps, if you don't mind, we could move to the end of the discussion and commentary part. Okay, so thanks, Corey, and let's move to our next discussant. And I'm pleased and honored to welcome Ottavio Bueno, who is professor and Cooper Senior Scholar at the University of Miami. Ottavio is a prominent theorist of science and logic, and actually also did a lot of work on the role of images in scientific reasoning, which is actually pretty cool. And visual evidence in science, what counts as visual evidence. And Ottavio is also editor-in-chief of journal Synthesis. Synthesis is probably the most prominent journal in analytical tradition and philosophy. Not just philosophy, actually, also mathematics and theory of science. So, Ottavio, I'm pleased to give the floor to you.
Well, thank you so much. And I would like, of course, thank Orhis and the organizers for this great event. Thank Jody for writing such a provocative and intriguing book. And of course, the audience to attend. So let me just share my screen. Do you all see it?
Yeah, I do.
Yes. Okay, good. So first, I think challenging knowledge is all we came to expect from a book by Jody, right? It's full of fresh, intriguing ideas. It's iconoclastic, it's engaging, it's imaginative. So it's a really, rich and intriguing book, right? Of course, what else can you find, right? But in an Azzouni book, the claim that knowing is vague, right? Or that Pyrrhonists fail to properly evaluate their own knowledge gathering methods, right? Of course, in making these claims, the book also can be resisted on a number of grounds. So what I'm going to do
also
today,
be resented. Is that what you said? I didn't hear what you said.
resisted.
Oh, resisted.
Yeah. So you can resist these claims, right? And that's what I'll be doing here, right? So I'm going to challenge these two pieces of Jody's arguments, right? One is it's unclear that knowledge is vague, right? Since to support this claim, at least in a philosophically significant way, would require establishing that knowledge satisfies a key feature of vagueness, right? It should be open to a Sorites argument, right? I'm going to try to argue that that's not the case, right? That something else is in the vicinity is vague, but not knowledge, right? And secondly, I think it's similarly unclear the Pyrrhonists fail to properly evaluate their own knowledge gathering methods, basically because they have no such methods in the first place to fail, right? So a proper understanding of Pyrrhonism would avoid some of the critical challenges that Jody raises. So these are the 2 points I'm going to be making in what follows. So let's start with the vagueness part, right? Now, in attributing knowledge builds up that point from, the challenging knowledge builds up from the attributing knowledge part, right? The idea that known is vague, right? On the basis of lexical vagueness. So in the earlier book, so initially actually attributing knowledge and challenging knowledge were supposed to be part of the same book, right? The book got too big, so Jody had to split into 2 books. Both became big books, right? And that's, as Jody was saying, he ends up writing quite a bit, right? So, but this is part of a, in many ways, it's the same project, right? The earlier project is how to attribute knowledge, right? And part of that book was a defense of known as being vague, right? And then challenging knowledge is the second piece of the overall argument. And Jody starts the book by picking up that piece, right? And on the basis of lexical evidence, he supports that known is vague, right? Now, even if we grant the empirical evidence that Jody provides for the claim that known is vague, right? At best, I think what this would establish is just a piece of particular empirically grounded ordinary language philosophy, right? You're looking at the way in which people use the predicate know in various contexts, right? And then in this loose way of vagueness, you can say, well, look, it looks like it's vague in this loose way. Yeah, so what, right? We all know linguistic usage is often all over the place, right? And it need not be indicative of the normative standards that we expect from epistemological notions, right? So that's one of the points of doing epistemology. You want to correct vague, unclear, confused notions that we find in ordinary context. So I actually don't think that there is much that the use of no we can get from that use that is philosophically useful, right? So what's needed actually is an examination of the concept of knowledge, right? What is the proper concept underlying that use? And in many ways, I think that's what epistemologists are doing, right? Their target in doing epistemological theorizing is to identify what a proper concept of knowledge is, right? Whether it is or it's not properly tracked in usage is a different matter, right? In many ways, we want to use better concepts than the confused ones that the folk end up using, right? But once we then focus the shift, right, from the concept of knowledge to the concept of knowledge, rather than the usage of the word know, it becomes clear that something crucial is missing in the argument, right? Because philosophically speaking, right, the notion of vagueness is actually a technical term, right? And a crucial feature of vague concepts in a philosophically robust sense, right, is something that's minimally open to a soriety sequence, right? As it's clear in cases of concepts such as red, heap, bald, and so on, right? So if you have someone who is clearly not bald, right, has a head full of hairs, and you take one hair out of the person's head, or the person is still not bald, right? And in general, if the person is not bald, but just by taking one hair out, the person suddenly will not become bald. So keep just taking hair and keep doing again and again. You end up with someone who has no hair also not being bald, right? That's exactly what the soriety's argument is. It's establishing, it's pushing, in a way, showing that there is a fundamental tension in the very structure of vague concepts, right? The result is effectively that vague concepts in the technical, philosophically interesting sense of the world end up behaving inconsistently, right? Everyone is bald and everyone is not bald. You just choose where you start the sequence, right? Someone who has no hair, right, like me, you add one hair in on the person's head, it doesn't fail to be bald, right? You keep adding hairs and that person full of hair now, it's also not bald. So we get concepts that are vague concepts that are inconsistent, right? Now, philosophical treatments of vagueness then aim to find more or less ad hoc ways of blocking the inconsistencies, right? You have, Williamson's maneuver trying to go epistemicist, right? Or Rosanna Keefe attempt to defend a supervaluation. Now, there are several approaches to try to say, well, we should find a way of blocking those inconsistencies, right? Because they are troublesome and problematic, right? So what's missing, I think, in Jody's case here is an argument to the effect that the concept of knowledge is open to such Sorites sequence. Otherwise, nothing has been said to address the philosophical relevant sense of the concept when the vagueness charge is made. But it's unclear, however, that this is the case, that the concept of knowledge is vague. In part because that concept is not just the kind of thing that it's open to the small increments that Sorites sequences require. Just the example I gave, just adding one hair at a time in someone's head, right? Knowledge just doesn't operate that way, right? What is open to such a sequence is not knowledge, but a particular conception of it, a conception that Jody actually is very sympathetic with, reliability, right? Now, my point is, it's actually reliability that is vague, not knowledge, right? And that matters, and that's a very different claim now, right? Here's what Jody says. Sufficient reliability is a necessary condition of knowledge methods. A method M of determining the truth value of P is reliable if using that method to determine the truth value of P is highly likely to yield the relevant truth value, right? So it's the high likelihood involved in reliability that makes this concept properly vague, right? As Jody continues, how reliable must a method of determining P be to meet our knowledge standards? Were infallible methods available to us, the answer would be clear, 100% reliability. Execute the method and the right answer will appear, godly standards, right? Clearly, a method can be 100% reliable, right? All the way to being 0% reliable, right? That's exactly where we have room here for vagueness. Under what conditions is the method highly likely to determine the truth value of a given claim, right? 99% reliability, 89, 57%, where do we exactly draw a line, right? It's unclear that there is a fact of the matter to determine this, since the answer can go in multiple different ways, right? Now here, as will be clear in a moment, we can run a Sorites sequence, right? Since we cannot have 100% reliability, how should we proceed? Now, Jody acknowledges this point, and he says, Allah, we must do with less. But how much less? There's no firm answer to this because no is vague. The word no is vague. And this is a property that the word shares with a number of words. How much reliability is required for methods? To what degree is not dictated precisely by ordinary usage practices. If a method is poor enough, everyone rejects it. If a method is good enough, everyone accepts it. And there are many cases in the middle where we disagree. Right? So here, the vagueness of the word no is used in the argument, right? That's part of the premise. But what is needed, and that's the point I've been pressing, is the vagueness of the concept of knowledge. Right? And that has not been established. So what we can establish is that the concept of reliability is vague, for it is open to a Sorites sequence, right? Here's an example. We have a premise. A 100% reliable method meets the standards of knowledge. Second premise, if a 100% reliable method meets these standards, so does a 99% reliable method. Third premise, if a 99% reliable method meets these standards, so does a 98% reliable method, right? More generally, we have, the conditional claim. if a k% reliable method meets the standards of knowledge, so does a k-1% reliable method. Of course, the conclusion is then a 0% reliable method meets the standards of knowledge, which is obviously absurd, right? But that's exactly the structure of a Sorites argument. That's exactly why the notion of reliability is vague, right? Thus, it's reliability, not knowledge, that is open to a Sorites sequence. It's reliability, not knowledge, that turns out to be inconsistent due to its openness to a Sorites sequence, right? This indicates that reliability is not a proper way of thinking about knowledge, right? So what we need to do is actually use this to challenge that this is even a good way of thinking about knowledge in the first place, right? So I leave this as a two-pronged argument, right? I'm both questioning Jody's claim to the effect that knowledge is reliable, and rather pointing out that, knowledge is vague, and rather pointing out that it's actually reliability that is vague. But because of the vagueness of reliability in the philosophically relevant sense of being open to a Sorites argument, then the notion, unless we have a proper treatment of vagueness, the notion becomes inconsistent. And you should probably not think of knowledge in these terms. Since Jody, as the quote earlier indicated, is sympathetic to reliability, at least as a necessary condition of methods for knowing, I think that's a problem for the view. All right, so that's the first part, right? Let me say a few things about the second, right? The Pyrrhonian way of thinking about these issues, right? So once Jody challenges Cartesian skepticism, right? Which, by the way, it's really a non-starter as a way of approaching skepticism. No one defends Cartesian skepticism, right? Skepticism in that way was an invention that Descartes invented just to reject it, right? So it's this kind of bizarre dialectical plot just to establish some knowledge. It's not a really interesting form of skepticism, right? But Jody comes along, criticized, I think rightly so, Cartesian skepticism, right? And then at the end of the book of Challenging Knowledge, he then considers a far more interesting form of skepticism, one that you can actually embrace and adopt, Pyrrhonism, right? The trouble is there he criticizes what he takes Pyrrhonism to be, rather than criticizing Pyrrhonism for what it is, right? So let me register my complaint about the way in which this part of his argument goes, right? The key difficulty here, I think, is the following. Jody has been highly influenced in his treatment of skepticism by what Michael Williams has to say, right? Which is actually really interesting. I think those books, about natural doubts and his theory of knowledge books are really rich and interesting books, right? But their main target is really Cartesian skepticism, right? And that's a problem because Cartesian skepticism is actually a form of negative dogmatism, right? It's a claim that knowledge is impossible, or versions of that claim, right? That's obviously not coherent, right? It's not a defensible form of skepticism, not a very interesting form of skepticism to begin with, right? To resist Cartesian skepticism, so the story goes, what you typically do, you find assumptions that the Cartesian skeptic embrace and show that these assumptions are untenable, right? And this only worked because Cartesian skepticism is a particular doctrine, right? It's a view that, for example, knowledge is impossible, right? Or variations of that kind of claim. And of course, doctrines have assumptions, and you can then criticize them in that way, right? So it works that way. The problem is that doesn't work for Pyrrhonism. Because in contrast, Pyrrhonism is not a doctrine. It's not a set of claims, right? But rather it's a stance. It's a way of conducting inquiry. In fact, Sextus Empiricus, when he systematizes Pyrrhonism back in the 2nd century, in his outlines of Pyrrhonism, he opens the book by saying that Pyrrhonism is an agogé, right? It's a certain way conduct, right? It's an activity, right? It's a way of doing things. It's not a bunch of claims, not a bunch of beliefs, it's not a doctrine to be believed. The skeptic is not defending a claim. The skeptic suspend judgments about those who make those claims, right? So the Pyrrhonist doesn't make a claim, but challenges the claims made by dogmatic philosophers, those who defend claims, say about knowledge, right? And indicates that according to the standards of those philosophers, right, the dogmatic ones, they fail to have the knowledge in question, according to their own standards. Right? So the Pyrrhonist argumentation is entirely dialectic, right? It's saying, look, here's the standards you abide by, and according to your own standards, you fail to meet the knowledge. I'm not making any claims about your standards. It's you're the dogmatic philosopher you're the one who holds the standards, not me. That's the way the Pyrrhonist will argue, right? So to try to identify underlying assumptions in Pyrrhonism is simply a non-starter, right? And unfortunately, that's exactly what Jody does, right? That's his strategy, right? And to identify these assumptions, right? And that doesn't work, right? So here's what he says, right? As Bueno puts in an opening lines of one of the papers I defend Pyrrhonism, and he says, I say that the Pyrrhonist is a well-known troublemaker who systematically challenged those who claim to have knowledge or justified belief by raising doubts as to whether, according to their own standards, they do in fact know what they claim to know or justified in believing what they claim to be justified in believing. Right? Then Jody continues, for a Pyrrhonic to manage what Bueno describes requires knowledge, and not just appearances. The Pyrrhonic must know that the standards of those who claim to have knowledge or justified beliefs are, right? So the claim here is that the Pyrrhonist who run the argument needs to know a lot of things, right? What those standards are, what the justified beliefs are, and so on. So to manage this, Jody says, one must know a lot. We again face the unpalatable options I earlier described, Jody says. One, Pyrrhonics seem to be talking about the same metacognitive matters, about inferences, standards, and so on, the dogmatists are talking about. Or two, that somehow to talk about dogmatists and what they believe is always to talk about appearances, no matter who does it, right? And I'm not persuaded that those are actually problems, right? Because the Pyrrhonists need not know in any philosophically substantial sense of knowledge what the standards of dogmatists are. Right? Pyrrhonists only need to invoke these standards so that dogmatists who recognize that these are their own dogmatic standards, so they only need to recognize that these are their standards in order then for the Pyrrhonists to argue that according to these standards, dogmatics fail to know what they claim to know, right? So the Pyrrhonists need not to know these standards. It's the dogmatist who has to have that knowledge. The Pyrrhonist is just pointing out, look, according to your own standards, here's what you claim to know, and here's how you fail according to those standards. I give an example that I used earlier in this own talk. Does the Pyrrhonist need to know the vagueness of reliability to criticize Jody's claim that knowledge is vague? Of course not. All that is needed is that Azzouni recognize that a criterion of vagueness is the openness to Sorites series for the challenge to go through, right? Of course, he may deny that, right? He says, no, I don't think that that's the case, right? Then he's just flying on the face of the accepted criteria for what vagueness is, right? The Pyrrhonists need not to endorse, acknowledge, know this criteria, right? What they need to do is just point out, look, these are the criteria that you guys recognize. And according to your own criteria, the thing fails. This is not the Pyrrhonist who needs to know, but the dogmatist. The result is then the dogmatists, according to their own standards, fail to know. And the Pyrrhonists would just keep suspending judgment. Right? So to conclude, despite the richness of challenging knowledge, I think it's unclear that key claims defending the book go through. Even if the word know is vague, it's unclear that the concept of knowledge is vague, right? What seems to be vague instead is the concept of reliability. And that is a way of challenging a particular philosophical way of conceptualizing knowledge, given the inconsistency in vague concepts, right? Bearing up a philosophically defensible account of vagueness, right? Which is unclear that we have in any case. Similarly, problematic is Jody's critique of Pyrrhonism, right? The Pyrrhonist need not know, let alone know a lot, to criticize the dogmatist. But I try to indicate that the standards of knowledge need not be embraced by those who claim to know. And then dogmatists fail to know in the end, according to their own standards. And that's all that the Pyrrhonist needs. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ottavio. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. So we are running out of time a bit, but if there are any urgent comments, questions, anyone is welcome. So Corey, I see, has raised a hand.
No, he took it away. You scared him off.
Oh, he was clapping.
Oh, he was clapping. Okay.
Okay, so Jody, do you have any comments or anything to?
Well, you said we were running out of time.
Well, we do.
I mean, I can. Of course I do. He's wrong. He's wrong. But I mean, I can say it quick. I can say it, this can be one line. Bold, turns out, is not vague. The concept that's underlying being bald is having very little hair. Very little hair is what is vague, not the concept of bald.
That's not right.
Parallel argument. That's what I'm saying.
No, I can run the Sorites argument for bold directly, and that's enough.
I don't think so.
Well, I just did in the talk.
Okay.
So
at this point, the debate has to go on to paper.
fair enough, we can. But the challenge is this: you need to show that knowledge satisfied the Sorites argument, and you have not done that.
Okay.
Okay.
I will fill that lacuna.
Good.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Ottavio. Thanks a lot, Jody. So, do we have Rodrigo with us? So, because okay, we are moving to our next speaker, who is Michael Glansberg, and I'm particularly happy to introduce Michael not just because Michael is a wonderful friend and good colleague and collaborator, but also because Michael is chair of our lab's scientific board, and he's also a distinguished professor at Rutgers University, a member of Executive Council Cognitive Science and Department of Linguistics as associate faculty, Michael's main research focuses mathematical logic, philosophical logic, semantics, lexical semantics, and metaphysics. So without wasting more time, I'm delighted to give floor to Michael Glansberg.
Oh, thanks. Let me share my screen, and let's see if I can share the screen correctly this time. Is everybody seeing my slides as just that window? Okay, so I think I've got it this time. So yeah, thanks for this really wonderful book, and thanks to Jurgis and the University of Latvia for organizing this. So what I'm gonna do is, as I'll say again in a minute, the thing I really should say up front is I am not an epistemologist. And so I'm very happy that Corey and Ottavio really engaged with some of the really fundamental epistemological issues. I will try at the very beginning to at least ask a couple of questions, very naive questions about the really central ideas in Jody's book. But a lot of what I'm going to do is jump into some details that happen to, if you're a semanticist like me, kind of push some buttons and make me want to talk about. And some of this will overlap with some of the points about vagueness that Ottavio just made, though I think they will complement reasonably well. So that's kind of what I wanted to spend a little time on, and let me try and keep track of the time too. Right, and so this is really what I just said. I'm not an epistemologist. I'm really not. I dabble in metaphysics, but epistemology has been mostly for me. it's been, epistemology for me has been mostly consigned to my teaching introduction to philosophy most years, which is by no means a serious qualification. But one thing I really liked is that as I thought about my own teaching about this material, I found myself quite sympathetic to the SPE framework. So when I teach skepticism, I often find myself wanting to say something that I think Jody said much clearer, that often the kinds of possibilities that skeptical challenges, particularly when we're talking about Cartesian skepticism, strike me as not serious. And I've often told my students, maybe you should shrug your shoulders and say, I don't care. But I think Jody's discussion of sort of real epistemic possibility versus mere logical possibility really shed some light on that. But I still want to ask Jody a question, and this is really a question. I really am trying to find my way through some of this. The other thing I tell my students is that we care about knowledge amongst the many attitudes because it has a kind of high standard that goes with it, right? That, you know, that merely wishing, hoping, believing doesn't always look like quite what we're up to, you know, and, you know, you can dress this up in terms of, you know, what scientists seek to achieve. I know serious epistemologists are very careful about whether science is really absolutely achieving knowledge, but nonetheless, this idea that there's a higher standard notion. And so I guess the question I did sort of want to ask is that this feels to be, this observation that knowledge is somewhat higher standard feels like it's a little bit out of sync with the kind of primary motivations that Jody's SPE view has, and particularly as he was talking about it in his overview a little while ago. I think it made it sound like knowledge was the wrong place to work on those standards. And so question I will sort of just flag as somebody who's learning their way, finding their way through this, is that right? Jody nodded a little bit, so maybe it is. One other thing I kind of wanted to ask about, I am with Jody very much on this idea that we as speakers are willing to attribute knowledge and I think other propositional attitudes quite widely, right? So I am happy to talk about, you know, lots of animals, preverbal infants. I think Jody's absolutely right about ants having very substantial cognitive, you know, situations, and that I am not going to be picky about like when we should ascribe knowledge or other attitudes. But I did sort of want to take a page out of Dan Dennett's book and ask Jody how far we should go with this. Because the thought, sort of reflecting on things that Dennett quite provocatively put, was we can get ourselves into moods where we will go extremely far with this. The famous example was a thermostat, which we often like to describe in, you know, what Dennett would have told us to our intentional terms. The thermostat thinks it's too cold. The thermostat wants it to be warmer. The thermostat makes it warmer. The thermostat perhaps knows that it should be warmer. And we talk that way. I think that's pretty straightforward. But at least a lot of us somehow are, particularly when you think about an old-fashioned thermostat, not the one you probably have now that actually has a substantial amount of computation that goes into it. The old one where it was simply the metal expanding and contracting and it either completed the circuit or didn't. Even though we were willing to talk about what the thermostat knows or believes or wants, many of us, not Dennett, were a little queasy about whether we really meant it, that it was just talk. And again, I don't think that's Jody's view, but I wanted to just ask a little bit, how far should we be tolerant about knowledge attributions in particular, but lots of other intentional attributions as well? All right, those were the general questions. And now I really am going to, you know, my primary work is in philosophy of language and some logic. I'm not an epistemologist. There were some philosophy of language points that came up in the course of Jody's book that I want to play around with because I find them interesting. I am not sure that they're absolutely central to the lines of argument, but I still want to kind of work on them a little bit. So here's one. Jody says that no, is a lexical universal. And I actually quoted this. A lexical universal, this means that it occurs in every natural language and with the same properties. And if I've spent a fair bit of time thinking about lexical meaning, and claims like this kind of leap off the page for me as being quite strong, to the point of being a bit provocative. And so I was kind of thinking, wait, do I think that? And I spent a little time looking around, and what I'll report back to you is that I'm really not sure if this has been fully established, but it looks like it might have some legs. I'll talk a little bit about what might go into that. So I'm still a little skeptical of whether this is a genuine lexical universal, but it might be, and that's something to really be curious about. So let's talk about this a bit. First, I do want to mention particularly that Jody argues some things really specifically, and in particular, in the appendix to the Challenging Knowledge book, what we get is a really extended discussion of knowing how versus knowing that. And as I understand it, Jody sees this as, one, it's important just because it's a standing issue. But also I take it that this is important because Jody's claim is no, there's really one meaning of no. There aren't two no's, knowing how and knowing that. And so at the very least in English, it looks like we've got one meaning. And not, I mean, up to the usual ways that words can be ambiguous or polysemous, but there's a kind of core atomistic meaning there that looks like it's just one. And so maybe English is pointing out a more uniform meaning than some people have thought. Jody also glances briefly at a couple of other languages that are familiar to some of us, French and German, which notoriously have pairs of expressions that can be loosely translated no, and I think Jody makes a good point that those aren't really substantial counterexamples. In the earlier book, he mentions some sort of notorious, when you work on the lexicon, everything is controversial, everybody disagrees about everything, and everything is notorious. I was about to say Bika's work is notorious, but that applies to everybody. So it's pretty controversial, like everything else in the lexicon. Along with Jody making some really good reminders about how to think about differences in meaning across lexical entries when you have possibility of metaphorical interpretations or polysemy, all of that seems right. And so we've got something here. But just to say in general for me, I like universals. If the world went the way I think it should, Chomskyan universal grammar would be true, tons of semantics would be universal. I think the world of universals would be great. But it's really hard to establish. And one of the things that we encounter, sometimes even if we think we might be in a position to make some guesses, we're not really sure what theoretically hangs on them. And so I think the statement here that I find most useful for reminding us what standards are and what we get out of it, this is this wonderful paper by von Fintel and Matthewson surveying what was then the state of the art about semantic universals. And looking at lexical universals, they're pretty careful about it. And they come to a fairly cautious conclusion, which I quoted. So what they say is, well, it appears that some small list of lexical items might survive close scrutiny. We'll come back to that. It might be that, in fact, there are a few words that literally have exactly the same meaning in every single language. We can't rule that out. But what they say is, we do not think there's much interest here. And here I think what's happening is a kind of theoretically more robust perspective. Languages do differ almost without limit as to which meanings they choose to lexicalize. And then they quote Levinson, who's saying, there are vanishingly few universal notions, if any, that every language has expressions. So what we're getting here is a kind of worry about what really will count and what we learn from it, even if it's true. With that in mind, I think it's a good idea to spend a minute or two asking what we mean by lexical universal and how, and what sort of standards we want to apply. And so here are a couple, there are many different ways of dividing this up. Here are some that I think are useful. One thought is just that speakers of different languages can all express the same ideas or concepts, or however you want to think about that. There's a little bit of controversy here. Certainly, defenders of linguistic relativity might be a little worried about this. There was an old literature, which some of you might know. It's getting kind of older, about what Jerry Katz called effability. This was the idea that every language can express everything that every other language can. And, you know, I think, though I don't think there's like an absolute settled view on this, I think the consensus is sure, probably. That doesn't seem too demanding or too unlikely. Do notice, by the way, that it's vanishingly hard. It's virtually impossible to refute the idea that every language can express the same thoughts, because effectively what you would have to do is walk up to some speaker of one language, show them a thought that they cannot express, but notice then they could express it. They just learned it and they'll express it. So actually proving that affability doesn't hold is difficult. It's a casual claim that probably. Jody, I'm pretty sure, is after something stronger. And then we get something that's kind of an intermediate position. And a good starting point for this is old work from Berlin and Kay on number words. And they observed that one way to put it slightly loosely is every language has words for black and white. Languages differ substantially in just which color words they have, but every language seems to have black and white. And to some extent, that's true. Oh, by the way, also do note sort of subsequent, much more recent work by Gerdenfors that really kind of developed some of this. The worry, and this is one we often encounter when we think about linguistic universals, is whether it's really the same meaning. And the observation with the color terms is that there's one sense in which, sure, if you needed to translate, if you were trying to take a language that's very different from English and you needed a word, you'd probably use black, and that would not be a bad translation. But that in fact, in many of these languages that lack color terms, they're quite more generous in which hues the terms apply to. And so then we face this kind of question. There's a casual way in which they mean the same, but there's a much more stringent way in which they don't. We'll come back to that in a minute, because often deciding that is really difficult. And then the stronger claim, which I think is the one that Jody wants, is that every language has, if you want a lexical universal, every language has what I put in quotes here as a lexeme, basically a morpheme, a relevant, memorized piece of linguistic stuff that expresses exactly the same meaning. These are really hard to prove, partly because just even knowing what counts as lexemes is not always transparent. Languages have lots of different grammatical, particularly morphological structure, and so this can get really hard. And then you really do have to make some fine-grained decisions about exactly what counts as same meaning. We kind of already glanced at this. But here are a couple of examples that are, one is, I think, some of these are relatively familiar. Hair in English is a mass term. I have some hair and not very much. I still get my hair cut. Haar in German is a count noun. I have my hairs cut, each of them. Is this the same meaning? There's a casual sense in which, yeah, I rather doubt that American English speakers and German speakers in Berlin really fundamentally think about hair differently. And yet grammatically, they're different. We also see this in lots of cases, right? So the English verb to blush represents an enduring state. You blush for 10 minutes. The Italian version is the point transition of going from not being red in the face to going red in the face. So for Italians, you can't blush for 10 minutes. It's instantaneous. Again, is that the same meaning? Well, pretty closely related. If you're grammatically careful, might not be the same. So the point here is that these are really hard to establish. Standards can be extremely demanding if you let them be. And the world of trying to establish universals, here I'll just make a quick comment methodologically, is difficult for other reasons. What you seem to want to really do this would be surveying massive, massive numbers of languages and checking for each one. But that's in tension with the observation that often you really need quite detailed study of one language to really be sure. And so there's a typological tradition that tries to survey a lot quickly. There's a much more, it doesn't have an exact label. There's a kind of analytic, to pull a term out of thin air, tradition that really wants to delve deep into language by language, and they often come to different conclusions. So notoriously, there's a fight about whether certain languages have adjectives. Some languages have very few. And some of the target example languages, it's the typological tradition said no adjectives. The syntacticians who get into the weeds go in and say, no, this is really an adjective. You just didn't look carefully enough. So these are often hard to establish. And just another kind of commentary about something that von Fintel and Matthewson mentioned, that the point that the lexicon is a place of great variation. A lot of the people doing comparative language work these days, so looking at primate language and bee language and birdsong and things like this, are really thinking that one of the things that seems to be distinctive of human languages is having the kind of open lexicon that we have. Nailing this down, like everything when you're doing interspecies work, very delicate. So exactly whether bird song counts as a lexicon is something that really gets disputed. But nonetheless, the idea that we can add and change and our lexicons are all very different, at least in coarse form, seems to be really distinctive of human language. Part of the reason I think this is so important is that gets me excited. I think that's cool. So hard to establish what's going on with no's. Go back to this paper that both von Fintel and Matthews and a bunch of other people cite. It's by Goddard from 2001. It's a very careful review of the current, what was then the current state of the art on these sort of projects of lexical universals. And by the way, Goddard is sympathetic. He's a collaborator with Wierzbicka. This is somebody who really likes these. He keeps narrowing down the list. The list gets smaller and smaller and smaller because every time you look harder and harder, you get more suspicious. And so the question about no's, I actually don't know what the answer is. Goddard basically thinks no's survives. So Goddard is on Jody's side, that it looks like this is going to stay on the list. Here are a couple of examples that Goddard mentions, which are disputed. So the sort of near translation of no's in Japanese, one is morphologically complex, so we have to ask ourselves whether this counts. By a certain high standard, it doesn't. By a slightly different standard, it does. But also it shows just that feature that I mentioned for blush, that it's disputed amongst Japanese linguists about whether the kind of core meaning here is the extended state of knowing or the point of coming to know. And this is a kind of pattern that we see cross language, and it raises just the question, is that exactly the same? Is that the right standard? Goddard thinks it probably is close enough. And then more going sort of what for people like me are more exotic cases, languages that Goddard, by the way, doesn't mention where these languages are spoken. So I will simply report what Goddard says here. There are some languages that seem to have, at least when first pass, are a few really general mental predicates, doesn't seem to draw some distinctions that we like. But then here a point that Jody and Goddard sort of makes the same kind of point. If you pay more attention to questions about ambiguity, particularly polysemy, this probably isn't a counterexample. There's one language that's cited that maybe doesn't that sort of merges the meaning of here and no together. But again, it's really sort of unclear what the status of that claim is. So, you know, what's really cool here is that this looks like it's, at least if we're like willing to be not absolutely massively strict, this looks like it might work. And for me, being one of these people who was initially extremely skeptical of lexical universals, that's very interesting. I think this is very cool. Okay, now a little bit of time on vagueness. And here, Ottavio covered some of the points that I wanted to bring up, but so I'll get to elide a little bit. Right, and so simple lexical vagueness, and particularly, as Jody mentioned to me, whether knows is really a lexical universal probably is not central to the main lines of argument. But the appeal to simple lexical vagueness, as I think Ottavio was illustrating, it probably is more central. And I'm worried about some details here. And this happens to engage a personal obsession of mine. So sorry, Jody, I'm going to use this as an occasion to fight with my demons as much as anything else. There's a lot that I do agree with Jody about here. So particularly that a lot of what really goes on with the meanings of expressions might not be transparent to speakers. Some of us call this, Jody doesn't use this term, but sometimes we call this semantic blindness. You're just not seeing these things about how your words work. That there's probably a lot subpersonal going on. That all strikes me as totally fine. I think that's how semantics often is. Always? I just said we have to be super careful about those generalizations, so we'll stick with often. But I still want to explore the claim that it's vague. And I want to start with what I think is the kind of primary evidence from Jody's book. And it's these two dialogues. One, and you've probably glanced at these, but remember these are courtroom settings, and the attorney says, presumably pointing at somebody, is there a chance that the man sitting there isn't the guy you saw that night? And the person says, no, I know, he's the guy, there's no chance. Looks perfectly good in some cases. Jody is very aware that this might differ case by case, but you can easily imagine a case where that's totally fine. But you can shift yourself to a not that different kind of case, still a kind of courtroom setting, where it goes differently. Okay, I admit there's a chance the man sitting there isn't the guy I saw that night. I don't know, maybe somebody was wearing a funny hat and, clever disguises confused me. And then the attorney, presumably this is the defense attorney trying to get the guy being pointed to off the hook, says, so you don't know that that's the man you saw, do you? And the witness can say perfectly well, I don't. And I take it that these dialogues sound just fine to me. They seem quite reasonable. And what that seems to mean, at least minimally, is that we can come to sort of reasonably situated people can come to different judgments about knowledge. And I take it that that's the kind of driving force for Jody about the idea that it's vague. I want to step back and say some things that here are very much, and just to add before going into some characterizations of vagueness, also that, look, it doesn't look like in this case we're going to, and here I think Jody makes this clear, we're not going to pull general principles out of the air that are going to help us decide those cases. Those do not look like cases where somebody violated some best practice or norm or something. It doesn't look like anybody's cheating or being willfully ignorant. They're just coming to different judgments. And that sort of has the air of vagueness to it. Picking up on what Ottavio was saying, and here I can be quick because Ottavio covered a lot of this. I, like Ottavio, want to ask, okay, what really counts as vagueness? And one thing I'm going to do is try and ask if there aren't other forms of, we don't have standard terminology for this imprecision. There are various ways in which the meanings of our expressions can not do certain kind of categorizing that we would hope they do. But it's not obvious to me that these are all vagueness. And so Ottavio already mentioned that being Sorites prone is like one of the central diagnostics for vagueness. And as Ottavio already mentioned, that tends to go with this idea that I think Crispin Wright calls tolerance, right? The idea that there are very small differences we can make and that those differences don't count, small changes we can make, and those changes don't count for whether you're large, bald, smart, all these things where we have like Sorites we can set up, and we set them up because we have that tolerance feature. At least that's a traditional diagnosis. I don't think there's an absolutely established list, but other things that you very often see are borderline cases. And in some people's lists, I happen to be rather skeptical of this. Some people's lists include higher order vagueness. If you don't know, that's just, if you have something that's borderline, the question of which things are borderline can also be vague, right? So, you know, if you have exactly, what's the right number of hairs to be borderline bald? 500, that sounds good. You know, so okay, 500 is presumably definitively borderline, but what about 590? That might be vague whether that's borderline. That's higher order vagueness. I happen to be in the minority here. I'm not sure I believe in higher order vagueness, but that's the minority. Everybody else believes in it, and so it's a diagnostic you see. I'm kind of with Ottavio that I think Sorites prone might be the most important diagnostic. And here I'm just I can skip this really because Ottavio basically ran the argument. It's hard to see a kind of Sorites argument with no's. And also it's hard to see what higher order vagueness for no's would be if you're looking for it. These are kind of hard to see. And I think as Ottavio was exploring, it's really hard to see a kind of axis on which you can get the kind of variation that would get a Sorites argument going. So maybe it isn't just that it's hard to see, but that we have some reason to doubt. But then the other thing I wanted to pick up at least a little bit is this question about whether we've got borderline cases and whether Jody's examples are giving us what's enough of a borderline case to count as sort of pushing us towards vagueness. And what I'm going to suggest is there's definitely something going on here, but I might prefer a different label. Here's a weak point, but I think it's worth thinking about for a second. In typical cases of borderline for canonical vague predicates, often we're supposed to feel a certain kind of indecision. Yeah, it's kind of orange, it's kind of red, I don't know where it should go. Or maybe that's enough hair to count as not bald. Maybe it is. And also we see these sort of forced march cases where if you show me enough examples, I'll move my judgments around in somewhat systematic ways. And so if we think about it that way, it's not clear to me whether what we're seeing in Jody's case is something like that. My suspicion is that each of the dialogues goes with a case where everybody's pretty clear and sharp, and there isn't any kind of feeling of uncertainty. Now, I said that's a kind of weak point because who knows, you know, who's going to have a feeling of uncertainty for what? I'm sure, you know, if you're nervous as a witness in court, I'm sure we could talk you into a form of uncertainty. So I don't know how much weight to put on this, but the point I wanted to follow this up with is that there's a way in which my suspicion is we have something that doesn't determine the extension of the word no, even in cases where everything is basically as sharp as we can make it. So the thought here, let's do it for no's, and then I'll come back to penguins, which I think is a clearer case. It's a courtroom. The evidence or whatever it is that's being used to make these decisions has been precisely laid out. The questions are clarified. There's a sense in which thinking about the courtroom setting is one where it's very hard to precisify everything perfectly, but courtroom settings are one where we try to go as far as we can to precisify everything that we can, and we still seem to have this failure to determine. And as I mentioned, this is a obsession of mine, like how many different varieties of semantic indeterminism there are and whether they're usefully subdivided. And so my obsession is that I think it's useful to separate off vagueness some from other forms. So then I go back and forth. Sometimes I call it indeterminacy, sometimes it's imprecision. But let me illustrate with a clearer case that I think is helpful. Are penguins birds? And here again, like according to ordinary usage, not according to sort of official taxonomies. And I haven't actually done anything really formal about this. Some psychologists have, and people are kind of like disagree sometimes. Some people call penguins birds, some people don't. But we have some useful models of what's going on in people's heads for these kinds of expressions. By the way, these models are not perfect. Like everything else in this domain, it's controversial, but we have some useful models. These are prototype models. So think of what you carry around in your head as a list of features and how important they are. And so birds like beaks, wings, feathers, fly, and these tend to have like ratings associated with them. But notice that's all perfectly sharp, or at least we can think of it as perfectly sharp. What do I do when I have to decide whether it's a bird? Well, look, it's got a beak, but it doesn't fly. How do I balance that? I have something that doesn't guide me to a decision, but it doesn't look like we have vagueness. Everything here is sharp. When in fact it looks like we do, at least this was the old theory, was we set up some similarity metrics and they have a cutoff point. We're somewhat arbitrary in our cutoff points, right? So you have to have enough of the high importance features and have not any or not enough of the like counter indicator features, right? So we can explain what's going on. This is a kind of imprecision because bird doesn't always give you an absolutely definitive answer on whether something's a bird or not. And I think we're seeing something similar for knowledge, that our grip on the word knowledge and our understanding of the relevant facts doesn't always tell us exactly. But what I'm urging here is that maybe we should keep a little bit more taxonomy and keep separate sort of which ones are vague and which ones are something else. Yeah, I'm taking up more time than I intended, so I'm going to try and move quickly here. This is basically what I said. I know I'm being taxonomically petty. Like, maybe who cares? But I'm urging that maybe we should pay attention. I think for time reasons, because I've made the main points, Jody makes a comparison to adjectives like flat, which I think is interesting, and I think there's some real puzzles, but I'm just going to skip this because I think I want more time for Q&A. What I want to do, just to close quickly, so I'll skip the material on flat. So let's put aside for the moment the taxonomic question, whether it's vagueness or something else. We have something that I think is reasonably described as some kind of indeterminacy. Decide what it is later. And Jody labels that as a kind of simple lexical vagueness. And what he says is there's probably, and I think I got this right, there really isn't any semantic or pragmatic mechanism. It's just there in the meaning. That's just how it works. And he notes that what we often do when we have to do the semantics in cases like this is we just use a correspondingly vague or imprecise term in the meta language. And that tends to do the trick, at least for some applications. I'm still worried. So assuming that there is simple lexical vagueness, indeterminacy, whatever it is, I'm still worried about how it got there. I want to know I still want a mechanism. I still want to know why it's there, what it does. And so here's a place where I'm sort of worried, even though I think for just getting things going, we very often do exactly what Jody says, right? We just go for the relevant term in the meta language that captures enough of the features of the meaning, and we're happy. I feel as doing work in lexical semantics that I feel like I want to get underneath that. I want to get into the subpersonal. I want to know what's going on with how these words really code up the meanings. Prototypes for bird are a decent example. They're not perfect, but they're one illustration of a way to try to do that. And so I'm worried that just sort of leaving it as that simple lexical vagueness is all over the place, and some imprecision is all over the place. By the way, I hate this fact. I want the world to be precise, but imprecision is all over the place. And as soon as you start looking at lexical meaning, you won't avoid it. But I still don't want to just stop and say it's just in the lexicon. I want to know more about like what's going on underneath. So I'm worried that Jody might be suggesting I have to quit my job, but Jody has told me I don't have to. Thanks, Jody. But I'm worried about like not wanting, even though I think that broadly speaking, up to some taxonomic quibbles, I think Jody's basically right. I still want more. I still want to go do the perhaps thankless and hopeless work of seeing what's going on underneath. And Yeah, so this is really where it was, just to remind everybody, study of language is littered with claims about things we'll never figure out. I think when we come to the lexicon, we may be hitting a point where maybe, yeah, we might never figure it out. But we should remind ourselves that prior to 1957, everybody said you'll never figure out the English inflectional system. And in walks a young Noam Chomsky wearing a tie, like MIT uniform, white shirt, black tie, totally like being the MIT boy, saying, I can do that. So we should be not too pessimistic about maybe being able to do things that look impossible. I think, yeah, lexical meaning is hard. Anything that we do with knowledge is particularly hard. All the stuff here is hard. I just still I'm like thinking, maybe I want to smash my head against the wall just a little while longer. So I think I will conclude with that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thanks a lot. So we are reaching the final discussion, final comments, critique, questions. So I mean, we are running a bit out of time, but so let's start with our speakers. Are there any questions, comments, anything Jody would like to say? There are a couple of questions also. I think at least one question also in the audience, and then there are a couple of questions online. So,
well, okay, I'll just say something brief. Some of the disagreements, I'm not sure that they're substantial between me and Michael, actually turn on background stuff that has been coming up in philosophy of language and in philosophy of logic, as he knows that I've been arguing about for some years. One of the things that's coming up is that I agree with him about, pursuing a more fine-grained analysis rather than just kicking stuff up into the meta language. But I actually think that the way to do this is not but using a Tarskian meta language, that you have to break with that. And what you're actually going to do is describe the object language that you're studying in terms of giving sufficient conditions and necessary conditions on these words, but not translating them into the language that's studying these languages. And I think lexical semantics, the way it's been evolving, fits that beautifully, that model. So that's off stage with the epistemology. The important question that I would raise, given what he said and what Ottavio has said, is can a successor view of what I'm calling simple lexical vagueness still do the work I want it to do in epistemology? And I think it can, because one of the crucial elements is precisely the semantic blindness. And what the semantic blindness does is it makes invisible exactly how a Sorites can arise. I think I can make that case. And it also makes invisible why what happens is people entrench into positions rather than waffle. And I think that's important. I think the more visible the vagueness is, the more you'll get waffling. The less visible it is, the less waffling you'll get. And with no, it's completely invisible. So I would try to claim, don't worry, I'm going to be able to still use these tools against the skeptic. That's just.
Thanks, Jody. Thanks. So, okay. Any other short, brief comments? So there was a question in the audience. I would probably bring the microphone to the colleague who was asking.
Thank you so much. That's a privilege to be there, and thanks to organizer, and thank you for so much for you. I could not read your book. I'm representing Asian studies. I'm head of Asian studies in Latvian University, and it was enormously interesting to read your book because I saw despite it is so much connected with Western tradition, still there are a lot of points that could be very important for our Asian colleagues in a communication. And as an outsider, I would like to ask you a humble question, how to deal with that, because we have to communicate. For example, regarding universals, in Indian universals are mental constructs, they would say, very similarly. But knowledge is not a wisdom, and even in German we say wissen, verstehen, begreifen, erkennen. And in Asia, to know the limits of the knowledge means to go deeper in a metaphysics, in a ultimate reality, or to escape logical constructs that are misleading us apart from the real reality. That would be the Buddhist concept. So my question is, what could I answer if an Asian colleague is asking, Professor, we can talk about math, abstract ideas without believing they really exist, but can a system built on logic escape the claim from our Asian colleagues that logic itself is a distortion? They would say, if our goal
logic
is
itself is a distortion.
Yeah, they would say that. And so sorry, I disagree with them, but I have to argue with them every day. And they would say, if our goal is to avoid inventing imaginary things, like Plato forms, could your system, which relies heavily on logic, accidentally create a new kind of reification, they would say. It's too much, so they would say, are you treating logic itself as too real? Because they would say you should avoid the concept as such, because that is guiding us in. How could we argue with them? It's a very simple level. So thank you so much. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks.
My answer to this really doesn't live in challenging knowledge. It lives in a lot of earlier work that I've done, like deflating existential consequence, talking about nothing, and ontology without borders. I'm going to translate the concern into my own terms, and I may or may not be fair by doing this. But in point of fact, I think an enormous amount of our attempts to understand the world around us involves what I want to call projections. There's fictions all over the place, and the result of this is what we have to try to do is build better ones and try to maximize the correspondence between the conceptual structures, the linguistic structures that we're building, and the world, getting it to match. There's no way that I personally am wedded to the particular logic that I'm using. For practical purposes, let's call it first order logic. The reason is that it's a technical apparatus. It was invented at a certain stage. It does not show up in natural language, on my view. But it is the best thing we have at the moment. So call it suboptimal optimality. That doesn't mean it doesn't create artifacts, falsifications, ways in which we're concerned about an aspect of the world that turns out to not be a concern about the aspect of the world, but an artifact of the logic or of whatever else we've built up. And I just see this as an ongoing struggle. I don't see it as being doomed to failure. I see it as something we're getting better and better at. I don't know if I've responded to your question, but I tried to.
So the summary from
just idea. Your book could be or should be translated into Chinese, actually, because Chinese colleagues are dealing with that problem, and that would be enormously interesting despite all the political situation. I could even take initiative in that if you agree. So thank you so much for the organizer and for yourself. Thank you so much.
Okay, sure. I'm interested.
Well, thanks a lot. So of course, we are running out of time, and we are running out of possibilities to answer a couple of questions that have been texted online. So we will make a after event release or publication where we could put those. Anyway, so it's unfortunately the time to finish our today's event, and let me thank to speakers, and let me thank also to the audience. It was not trivial to adjust our time scales and let's say different time zones, and I would like to give the floor to final word, closing word to Professor Azzouni.
Yeah, thank you so much. I can only join Jurdis in thanking our panel, our speakers. But I would like to extend thanks to Jurdis especially for organizing all this event, to putting it together, and our Department of Public Relations at the University of Latvia, because as you can see, there's some technical issues with that as well, and people organize this technical part of the event excellently. And finally, on behalf of those of us, and in the audience I see several of my colleagues who are not philosophers, I think that we enjoyed this discussion at least on two levels. First of all, of course, topic itself is important in general. We see that in our very polarized society, when we are currently polarized on any imaginable issue, starting from science and ending up in politics and everything in between, I think that discussion what we believe and why different people are believing in different things is extremely important. But on the other level, I think that we enjoyed this very friendly and sophisticated discussion to see how philosophers are exchanging so friendly, so sophisticated arguments. So process itself, I think, was really enjoyable for us. So thank you very much.
I guess
Well,
we just leave.
I guess that's it. Hey, this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was.
Thanks, Jody. That was.
What